Hello, everybody. I'm just going to say this in order to let you know that we are using sound. Your sound is working, but we're just letting people in at the moment. So give us a few minutes and then we will kick off. And the number of participants is shooting up, which is great. So we'll probably leave it another minute. Right, I think we could probably start. Naomi, are you okay?
Yes, yes.
I
mean, do you want to also mention Helen's video as well, why that's off, just to start off with?
Oh, yes, I will, yes. Helen's video is off because there is a technical issue with her entire screen exploding if not turned off. That's what I understand anyway, very technical explanation. But I just wanted to say hello to everybody. This is a really impressive number. We're nearly 200 and rising, so I hope more and more people do join. I'm Sophie, I'm a negotiations official for Bectu, and we hope that you are all keeping safe and well, and you're not going for, you know, a little spin to check your eyesight. But seriously, it has been a very worrying time, and we do understand how difficult and how tiring it is to live with constant uncertainty and with what pundits are describing as existential dread. So we hope that this webinar will be a way of at least voicing some of your concerns and looking for solutions. There are two sections to it. Helen will kick off with feedback from the ThoughtExchange, and thank you very much to everybody for taking part in that. She will then update us all on the changes in the furlough schemes. Then we'll move on to Dougie, who's going to be talking about health and safety concerns, not what your concerns are now, but what they could be in the future when you're returning to work. We'll go through quite a few slides. During all of that, what I would say is do start putting your questions into the Q&A section, because we'll have a big question and answer session at the end of both those presentations. Not so much in the chat section, largely because I'm a bit useless and can't toggle between the two, but also because I think it's more useful if you make your comment or your, you know, your general remarks and then end with a question. So it could be, you know, this is the situation in my workplace, but, you know, how can we get out of it? Would this be a solution? So try and keep to the Q&As, and also through the presentations, there might be, well, there will be 2 polls. So just very quick poll sections where we ask you a yes and no question, and if you could all take part, just to have a quick sense of how everybody's feeling about particular issues. So thank you very much again, and I'm going to pass you to Helen to kick off. Helen's mute.
I'm not now. I've managed to unmute myself.
Wrestle yourself out.
Hello all. Right, this is going to be a whistle stop of the ThoughtExchange, and the reasons why it's a whistle stop is there was quite a lengthy article that we actually put onto the Bectu website. So if you want to actually go on there, you can actually read more of this. So Naomi, could you start the slideshow for me, please? Right, thank you. So if we can go through, I won't keep telling you when to change, Naomi, because I think you know when we've got to change them anyway. So this is just to start off with giving you a bit of context about Bectu. So Naomi, if you can flick the screen for the next slide. So, because we're always asked how many members we get, just thought that this would be quite interesting. Bectu has over 5,500 members working in theatres across the UK, and I must say that that figure is rising now. So that figure was actually done about 2 weeks ago, and we've had a substantial amount of new joiners since then, so it has gone up, I'm pleased to say. A majority of our members are employees or workers on permanent fixed term or 0 hours contracts, but we also have a number of freelancers who work in theatres. Bectu has minimum terms agreements with SALT and UK theatres, but we also have many house agreements that enhance those terms provided by those agreements. But in addition, there are many theatres and independent producers who are not members of either UK theatres or SALT. And with those, some of those we have local or house agreements over a range of those on different issues. So following that fateful day back in March when the instruction to close theatres was given, it's been a turbulent road for everyone. Firstly was all the campaigning and the introduction of the job retention scheme, which was good news for many workers who were contracted on a PAYE basis. And Bectu officials worked together with employers to get as many people as possible furloughed to save jobs and preserve skills that are necessary for the theatre industry to survive. We also saw the introduction of the self-employed scheme, which, as we all know, is far from perfect. Unfortunately, despite all our best efforts, some people fell through the cracks and were not able to access either scheme. But I do have to say that theatres have done better than most of the parts of the creative industries by embracing and maximising the use of the government scheme. At the start of May, Bectu launched the ThoughtExchange, and the question that we asked was, what are your main concerns regarding the steps that will need to be taken for your theatre or production to open up for business again in a safe and viable way? Over 750 people participated with thoughts, with 697 issues raised and over 12,000 ratings. The top concern was the worry that theatres will be one of the last industries to reopen, and that will be after any grants and furlough scheme have been discontinued. Some of the other furlough concerns highlighted included the theatre running out of money, or there being a gap when the furlough scheme ended, and the theatre being able to reopen or being able to sell tickets and generate income. People were concerned that there will be mass redundancies or that the job retention scheme will be reduced. Obviously, the ThoughtExchange was before Friday's announcement on the scheme, which I'll come on to and explain later. There was quite a lot around practical concerns around the need to build public reassurance and confidence for them to want to pay and visit theatres. The issue about whether there should be national guidelines and standards, something I personally think would be very helpful, and I think Doug's going to deal with that later. Issues around social distancing, not just on the practicalities on audiences and how that would work, but in the auditorium, but also toilets and washrooms, bars, etc. And obviously reduced audience capacity impacts income. How will social distancing work for staff who was also raised, including the point that backstage work and some front of house box office areas are notoriously tight. The final point I'm going to flag is the concern that fewer resources might mean less diversity in programming, production and audiences. Bectu has been working with both employers and members to try and introduce steps to improve diversity, and it would be a pity, in our opinion, if all that were lost. So that's an overview of the ThoughtExchange, and as I say, there is a more in-depth commentary on that. If I can come on now on to the changes to the job retention scheme that have come in from July, and they were expanded on at the announcement last Friday. So effectively, there's three main changes that were announced. So that's flexible furlough, the closure of the JRS to new furloughees. I think that's a word we've made up, but it's one that serves a purpose, and the amount of the JRS payment. So if we look at the flexible furlough first, so from the 1st of July, employers will be able to bring back furloughed workers on a part-time basis. Obviously, they must pay the employee in full for the hours that they work. They can't claim twice, so they can't claim for the furlough, the full furlough, if they're working for part of that. And the changes must be confirmed to the employee in writing. Interestingly, as we know at the moment, the furlough, you have to be furloughed for periods of 3 weeks or more. The minimum period for part-time or flexible furlough is 1 week, but it can be longer. But the important date here is that it will only apply to employees who have been placed on furlough by their employer by the 10th of June. And I ask you to remember that 10th of June date, because that is important going forward. If we go on to the next point, which is the closure of the job retention scheme to new furloughees. So again, to be entitled, you must have been placed on furlough by the 10th of June. It's making it clear that going forward from the 1st of July, the scheme will only be available to those employers who've previously used the scheme. Again, the 10th of June. So whereas before we've had different other cut-off dates, the 10th of June is quite pinnacle, because if you're not furloughed by the 10th of June, we're not going to be able to do anything later. If we then come on to the amount of the job retention scheme payment, this was the big area that we were all very worried about, and there was lots and lots and lots of commentary about, is it going to be 20% immediately, is it going to be 40%, what's it going to be? And the one thing we have noticed about this Chancellor is that he does keep his cards very close to his chest, and so it wasn't initially as bad as what we had all anticipated and braced ourselves for, but I must stress it is still not great for the theatre industry. So from the 1st of August, the level of the JRS payment will start to be reduced. So for the month of August, the 80% remains the same, but employers will have to start paying the employer national insurance and pension contributions, which on average, and this is an average, it's around 5%, okay? Then from September, the job retention scheme will drop down to 70%. The employers will have to make up the additional 10%, and again, also continue to pay the national insurance and pension contributions. So yes, it says 10%, but effectively they're roughly going to have to pay 15%. And then in October, it drops down to 60%, so effectively 20% top up plus NI contributions and pension. And then the intention is that the scheme ceases at the end of that period. What Bectu is now doing, because obviously there is a lot of concern over the gap between the job retention scheme ceasing and when theatres can start opening, and indeed there is also a lot of concern about whether employers can actually afford to make the contribution when they haven't got any income. Yesterday we did, Bectu hosted a session with employers. We had almost 100 employers participate in that session, and it was all about what are the challenges that we'll be facing going forward, what do we need to do to lobby, how can we work together. We did a couple of polls on that call, that was quite interesting. So some of them were quite depressing. So when asked whether the changes to the job retention scheme did they think it would result in making staff redundant, 74% of the employers participating said yes, they did think that was the position. 88% supported a joint employers and union call for government funding as the industry continues to understand how it will operate. And finally, 96% of those participating supported an industry-wide guideline on returning to work. Following that conversation and further consultations that we've been doing with the employers, we're in the process now of writing back to the DCMS and also considering what other additional lobbying we need to do with parliaments and the MPs. So it is still much very work in progress. We are very clear that in this industry, unless we get some sort of further government bailouts, then there are going to be companies that will struggle with having to make those contributions. So on that note, I'll end there and then hand over to Doug to deal with health and safety.
Hi everybody, I'm Doug McGill. I'm organising official based up in Scotland in the north of England. I'm just going to go through some pointers for people for safe returning to work in the current pandemic. The government's advice to industries and businesses is that they need to do specific COVID-19 risk assessments and put that into the existing risk assessment regime for safe returning to work. Our colleagues at the film and TV side of things have produced national guidelines and standards in association with the employers associations, and they've been published earlier on this week and last week, and they're very good, very comprehensive. Unfortunately, we've been getting a bit of resistance from some of our employer associations in doing a similar thing across theatres, but we're still working on it, and we're still pushing them hard to get a joint approach to how we can allow our workers and our members to return to work safely. The best way of looking at it is if you look at the standard hierarchy of controls and apply them to the current situation. When it comes to the preferred option in the hierarchy of controls, number one is elimination. Unfortunately, eliminating the virus is not within our hands to be able to do it. So as a consequence, there's not very much we can do about that, other than hope for a vaccine to be produced and distributed. Secondly, substitution. Again, we can't substitute the virus for one that's less harmful for obvious reasons, so that's not really an option that's open to us. And then that takes us down to the third option, which is engineering controls. Now, this is something that we can do quite a lot in our theatres and in our workplaces. There's a whole number of things that people need to consider when they're looking at the risk assessments, but I'll just run through them quickly. Redesigning workplace for social distancing, so that would apply to things like staircases, to office spaces, to meeting rooms. Repurposing rooms, reducing the number of employees who are using any communal rooms at any one time. Identifying pressure points within buildings, so by that I mean things like staircases, toilets, the green room, redesigning the workplace so people are using one set of stairs to go up and another set of stairs to go down, so that might include bringing fire exits and that kind of thing into more general use. Again, phasing breaks and shift patterns so there's not too many people in the same areas at the same time would be an option that could be done. We need to look at hand washing facilities and sterilisation facilities and make sure there's enough of them to go around and they don't become pressure points in themselves. Making places where people most frequently touch, so obviously things like door handles, control panels on the equipment, things like entry systems at stage door and things as well, they would need to be cleaned down or actually taken out of use altogether, might be a better options. As I say, frequent and stringent cleaning regimes, changing cloths. Where equipment and tools are shared, then there has to be consideration that no longer sharing them, making sure that they're cleaned down and sterilised on a regular basis as well. Then again, communication with management, informing employees about the disease, the symptoms, so they understand what's happening to them and their families and their colleagues as well. Issues with travelling to and from work need to be addressed. We need to look at how we manage temporary workers to make sure that they're informed when they come into the premises that they're following the standards that our premises are now adopting. And then methods of enforcement and reporting breaches as well. So they're all covered under engineering and administration controls. The last one we need to touch on as well is PPE. personal protective equipment. That's normally considered to be a last resort, but obviously within our organisations and our business models, then people have to be very close to one another, whether it's like in dressing rooms, hair and makeup people, for example, stage people working together, people sharing lighting booths, all that kind of thing. PPE will need to come into practice. There are two types of well, one type, surgical masks, which are acceptable to be used. There's two types which have been recommended, the IR and the IIR types. As I say, they're surgical masks. We've seen plenty of people wearing them. You might even be wearing themselves travelling in public transport. And then there's ventilators as well, which are FFP2 or FFP3. I mean, you take a look at Amazon, you'll see them, and they're very common and they're not expensive. The good thing about ventilators is that they can be reused and they can be washed and things as well, so that keeps the cost down. However, the downside with using ventilators and surgical masks, if you're a stagehand and you're doing a get in and a get out and you have to wear masks for more than 2 hours, it becomes extremely uncomfortable and extremely unpleasant. So that all has to be taken into account, and people need to make sure they get given proper breaks from having to wear these things all the time. The last bit of PPE, which has been quite common as well, but I'm going to cast a wee bit of warning on that. PPE for gloves, nitrile gloves and things like that, actually the virus stays on them, so if people are wearing gloves, they're tempted to touch their face and things as well more frequently than normal, and you have to be very careful with that because you could infect yourself. It's much better actually to have a much more stringent regime of washing your hands in soap and water or using sterilisers rather than using gloves. So you need to be careful with that one as well. Next one, so Naomi. Yes, obviously departments. I mean, each department has its own concerns and things that they need to worry about. We all know who the departments are, and you know we've touched on places like wardrobe, stage, but also box office, front of house, admin departments, the whole gamut. Each department will have to have its own risks assessed in a separate COVID-19 risk assessment. I should stress that we don't have to completely redo all of the risk assessments from scratch. It's just there's an additional factor that needs to be brought into play, and that is the existence of the virus as an additional hazard in the workplace. So it can be daunting when you start to look at all of the areas that you need to address, but as I say, it's just one additional hazard that has to be factored into the risk assessments. So it's not quite as daunting as it might appear in the first instance. The next one is obviously with audiences and its access to and from the building, to and from the auditorium, to and from bar areas and toilets and things. So areas that you need to look out for are things like queues for entering the building, queues at the box office, at ticket uplift points, at programme sellers, ice cream vendors, that sort of thing. Queues at bars and catering, queues for restrooms, entering the auditorium, accessing the different levels, seating arrangements, whether or not to have intervals. There's been quite a lot of talk and not having fixed intervals, and actually so people can stagger when they take breaks and things as well. That's something worth considering. Exiting the auditorium at the end of the performance, again, there's going to be pressure points and queues building up there as well. Emergency evacuation has to be considered, any adjustments and changes that need to be made to those routines. Do we need additional first aid points, etc., and facilities for audience members with particular needs? And that's kind of my overview. What I'm trying to do is bring together in conjunction with our partners across the industry is checklists and things as well that can be pretty comprehensive. I had a session last week with the ABTT, which was really good. They're very far ahead of the game in terms of how that affects their people. I've made contact with the Federation of Scottish Theatres and SALT and the UK theatres as well. So I'm hoping that we can bring all the interested parties together and do, as I say, industry-wide standard guidelines and standards for our people. And once the comprehensive checklist is together, then it'll be available to all members that they can dip into and apply it to their workplaces and their departments as well. And that's me until questions and answers.
Thank you, Dougie. Thank you, Helen. Sorry I suddenly disappeared earlier. I was thrown out of Zoom. It wasn't because I lost interest. So that might happen. There may be a technical issue where I'm suddenly wiped out, in which case Naomi will step in. But thank you very much to Doug and Helen. And we've had some questions coming through. So I'm going to take, there was one that said that the government seems to be ignoring theatres in the briefings, and why is that? From everything that Tracy Brabin, the MP, told us, but also from all our own parliamentary lobbyists, we do know that there is a lot going on in terms of explaining the difficulties for theatres, how impossible it is to open without lifting the social distancing restrictions, how we need more time, how we want the theatre industry, and at least live events, to be an exception to the new furlough conditions. You know, can we have the furlough continue without strings attached? Is there some way of injecting more money into the industry to see us through until theatres are able to reopen? So there's a hell of a lot going on. So I suspect that the Chancellor's not commenting because it's so complicated. But maybe Helen or Doug want to add to that. They're not ignoring us. I think they realise that we are a sector that just can't open at the moment, and so they're dealing with the sectors that can. But there was the question about NIMAX. NIMAX is furloughing everybody until July. Is it likely that they'll furlough beyond? And then there's a question about insurers. Is there a danger that employers will not want to take older workers back because there might be an insurance issue? I genuinely don't know what the answer is to that because it hasn't been raised before. But maybe Helen, if you could deal with the NIMAX question and the insurers.
Well, I can't answer about NIMAX because you've been dealing with NIMAX. So
No, I mean in general, how, you know, will employ? I mean, I can answer that. So employers, we don't know what employers are going to do. Because they're taking stock and they're not telling us yet. But they may, we hope there will be employers who can consider the cost of and have the resources to pay for national insurance and pension contributions, and then go on and pay the increasing percentage over the months. So we hope that there will be employers who will be able to afford that, but there will be a lot of employers who won't. And it's all to do with what we can negotiate from now on, company by company.
Yeah. I think with regard to the insurance question, I think that's quite interesting. I think there's going to be health and safety issues there around what the government advice is about whether the older people are the last to return back to work and whether they're more at risk. I think, as we all know, to discriminate against a person on the grounds of their age is contrary to the Equality Act. But the problem is there could be an objective justification for the reason for the differential treatment. So I think that's something we're going to have to look into as we go forward. And I think that's certainly something, Doug, I think we need to look at in the advice for health and safety wise.
Yeah, I made a note of that. I'll take that up with Tony Lennon, actually.
Okay. Sophie's frozen. So Naomi, do you want to dive in and deal with any of these questions we want to deal with?
Yeah, so, okay, so you've done the NIMAX one and you've done the insurance one. I think probably the next one that I picked out was, do you think the self-employed freelance way of work within theatres will be changed in a big way post-COVID, with more companies and theatres possibly preferring to use in-house staffing rather than using freelancers?
Well, there's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think the point, I mean, there's two schools of thought. Lots of people think it's going to go one way, and other people are thinking it's going to go the reverse. I mean, I think we will see companies, and we're already aware that Salt have already started to have the debate about doing some temporary variances on the agreements, the collective agreements, and I think we will probably start seeing that as we go through. That will have to be done employer by employer, where we've got local house agreements. Will we see less freelancers? I don't know. The jury's out for me on that. I don't know whether, Sophie, you've got any feeling about whether you think that there'll be less or more freelancers when we start getting back.
I think it's very difficult. Unfortunately, I've missed a bit of the discussion. And also, Naomi, just so that you know, every time I come back in, I lose the questions. So it may be that you need to step in.
No, the question that was being asked was basically about, do we think that post-COVID things are, the freelance self-employed way of working in theatres, do we think that's going to change, and do we think things are going to become more in-house as a result?
Well, sorry everybody, because I think Helen might have said this, which is that they're certainly looking for greater flexibility, but there's no conversation about more freelancers at all yet.
Okay, so should I pull out another question, Sophie? Or
yes, did Helen answer the insurers one, or did we not have it?
Yeah,
yeah.
I answered that.
Okay.
Okay, so the next one I'll pull out.
I think the one from Shona is interesting.
Yeah.
Changes to the furlough system. Could you be added to furlough scheme now, even if you didn't qualify previously because you weren't on the RTI payroll by the 19th of March? The answer to that is very clearly no. That RTI date does not change, I'm afraid.
Okay. So did you have any questions you pulled out, Sophie, or do you want me to pull out another one?
Well, maybe we should do a few health and safety ones.
Yeah, I'm happy for that. If you want to, there's quite a few, so if you can just read a couple out to us, Sophie.
Pardon?
If you just read a couple out to us, then I'll do my best.
Yes, so there was one question of, is anyone pushing back on implementing health and safety guidance? And I don't believe that anybody is. It's all under discussion. If anything, all the employers we've been talking to have been incredibly imaginative and creative in trying to find ways round everything. But then there was a question about test, track and trace. Did you see that one, Dougie, about, what if the companies open up, they start rehearsing, somebody's found to have contracted the COVID virus, they have to isolate for 14 days. How can any company plan for those kind of eventualities?
Yeah, well, one of the things that's been discussed, well, I'll take it two levels. When it comes to the performing side of things, one of the things that's been discussed, which is quite interesting, is that the performers and the directors, etc., themselves self-isolate in advance of the rehearsal period starting. So, for example, one of the things that came out of film and television is that the cast and crew check into a hotel for 2 weeks and don't meet anybody from the outside world at all in those 2 weeks. And once everybody is tested and is shown to be clear, then they can move on with the rehearsal process and be in close proximity to one another because they've been, isolated for 2 weeks in advance. So that's an interesting idea. In terms of crews and things as well, the idea that's kicking around, and this came up at ABTT last week as well, is actually you have what's known as the cohort model. So what you have is you effectively have two crews, for talking sake, a red crew and a blue crew, and they only work together on any production at any one time. If somebody in the blue crew comes down with symptoms, then the blue crew is stood down and the red crew comes in. Does that make sense? So they're sort of like they're ready to take over from one another if what somebody in either of the cohorts becomes unwell or shows symptoms. But again, the issue with that is then you're doubling the number of people you're employing. So obviously the expense kicks in there big style.
Thank you. Just a warning, we've got lots of participants, so thank you very much. We may not be able to answer all questions, but try and keep everything you're saying in the Q&A box, because the chat one we're not necessarily going to look at if we're trying to get all the questions answered.
Yeah, and if we don't get all the questions answered, then we can answer them offline and write back to people. Yeah.
Yeah. There's one question about I'm the only go on.
Just to say, if anybody's unsure of where the Q&A box is, if you just take your cursor to the bottom of the gallery screen, so where the videos are, go to the bottom of the screen and a bar will pop up and it will say Q&A, and you literally can just type your question in there. And we'll be able to click on answer live or type an answer, whereas in the chat it can get lost.
There's a question here, Dougie. I'm the only ethnic minority in my front of house. I live with my mother who is diabetic. When do we go back? When we do go back, what consideration will be made for people like me who live with huge risk people? I felt very vulnerable before lockdown just through the notion of the job, but what negotiations will Bectu do to protect us from repercussions where we might be the only ones facing a particular circumstance or a particular risk?
Well, the government's guidelines is pretty clear on that. You know, if you're living with somebody who is in one of the high risk categories, then you shouldn't be forced to go back to work. And the union will absolutely support people in those cases as well, because I mean it's lunacy to make people go back to work and then possibly bring infections back to the household as well. I mean the whole point of isolation and what have you is to keep people apart and to lessen the risk to vulnerable people.
We've got some questions for Helen.
Sorry, Sophie, should I launch one of our polls?
Yeah.
Okay, so the first poll that we wanted to do was just around job retention, because we've been talking about the furlough scheme, and just because things have changed on Friday, we wanted to have an idea of where people were if things develop. So the question is, would you prefer, if there are redundancies made in your theatre, or if they're being considered in your theatre or show, would you prefer no redundancy payment but a guarantee you will get your job back when your theatre show reopens, over redundancy money now? It's a bit of a bleak question, but I think we have to start thinking about worst case scenarios. So I'm going to launch that poll now. Okay, if you want to continue, Sophie, and then I'll let you know.
So this is a question for Helen. Just a point to raise: if we end up with solutions for the theatre industry which centre around buildings and employers, those of us who weren't fortunate enough to be on PAYE contracts in February, so I'm assuming you are a freelancer, self-employed, you invoice for your work, would you, so the question is, would you continue to be excluded from any kind of help? What can be done about this?
Well, we have been lobbying because, as we know, the self-employed scheme, as I said earlier, is far from perfect, and lots of people have fell through those cracks. I mean, we're still with the other FEU, Federation of Entertainment Unions, still trying to lobby to get people brought back in. But I think now that the end is in sight, and we know that scheme has been extended slightly as well, I don't think, and I'm just being realistic, that there's going to be any widening of that net to allow further people to be able to apply. So unfortunately, I'm not entirely convinced that we're going to change the government's view on that, or position on that, I'm afraid.
Okay, and if workers are made redundant, will it be a condition if the show reopens, they're offered first refusal on their job? And that's exactly why this poll is there, because if you're made redundant, that is a dismissal, that is the end of your job. And then several months later, if the show reopens, then it's a matter for the employer to recruit. So that's what we're looking at. What are the, are there ways in which we find alternatives that are sort of layoffs, where there is a continuity of employment even though you're not being paid, so that you have a guaranteed job at the end of it? But at the moment, redundancy does mean the end. I don't know if you want to add anything, Helen, to that.
No, well, yes, I will add something. I am talking to our legal department about this point. The difficulty that you have with the redundancy regulations as they stand and the HMRC provisions, because that's what the two things that you have to look at, means that you can't have the offer of re-employment by an employer at the point at which you're made redundant, because that actually negates the term for the redundancy payment. And that's something that I'm talking to, as I say, to our lawyers about, to say, well, you know, if it is in 6 months' time, would that be okay? Could we enter into that type of arrangement, and would it be enforceable? I've yet to have an answer on that, but I suspect the answer is probably going to be no.
Okay, then the question, with employers having to contribute to the furlough scheme as of August, are casual staff at risk of being removed from their furlough schemes as theatres move to look after their full-time staff? I think that is what we're saying, that the risk for everybody is very great from August onwards, because employers will have to think, how long, there's no money coming in, they're not selling any tickets, how long can they survive on whatever contingency pot they have between now and December, or possibly next spring? And so in that calculation, I think everybody's very, very vulnerable, and not just casual staff, but yes, they will be looking at what can we afford, and they will have to prioritize who they believe to be key staff.
Do you like the results of the webinar, Sophie?
Go on.
Yeah, okay, so I'll end the polling now. We've got about 80% of the call have voted. And just to say, you know, there's been some people in the chat who are like, you know, couldn't we have more options than this? This is not Bectu saying these are the two options, that is the end. It's purely just to kind of get a feel for the room, because we are in this difficult situation. We just want to get an idea of where people are. So in terms of, would you prefer no redundancy payment and a guarantee you will get your job back when your theatre show reopens over redundancy money now? 62% have said yes, and 38% have said no. That was about 80% of the call. So there's a few people, there are a few people who were saying, I don't know, I'm not in that headspace yet. So I'll share the results.
Thank you, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to go quickly to one last one for Helen, and then I'm going to go back to Doug again if I can find questions. Will the new equity agreement on changing touring agreements affect us?
If you're on tours, yes, because there is no specific Bectu agreement, just the same as there is no MU agreement. Anybody who's on tours, for the allowances, you either come under the UK Theatres touring agreement, or you come under the equity touring agreement, which I understand from equity, the rates have been frozen and they've accepted that.
Okay, I saw one about gloves. Is there another one that you've picked up that you'd like to come back on?
There's so many of them, I can't follow them all, to be honest.
Yeah.
So as I said earlier, we're going to follow up and answer as many questions offline as we possibly can. So if you want to read the one about gloves to me, that would be good.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, Naomi, can you read it?
Well, I was doing the question. Okay, so we had one question where it was like, you say about not using gloves, but what about when you're doing a costume fitting? Is it better to wear them or not wear them? Is a mask better for a fitting? So that's quite a specific question when you're going to be quite close to the performance.
Yeah, this is kind of the thing that I was highlighting in my talk. Different departments will have different particular issues, and that's why we need to go through it quite closely. In terms of wearing gloves, I'm not saying don't wear gloves. I'm saying wear gloves if you have to, or if it's the best thing to do. I mean, if you're handling noxious substances and stuff, then of course you wear gloves. But you just need to be aware that the virus can stick to gloves as well. So you need to follow the regime, the safety regime for the gloves, and change them regularly and dispose of them and make sure they're disposed of properly as well. and yeah, and obviously wash your hands and things. And again, masks, it's horses for courses. The best mask, it depends on the environment you're working in. I would say probably a respirator rather than a mask for working in hair and makeup. But again, you have to be aware of, you know, if you're putting makeup onto an actor and the actor doesn't have a mask on and you're wearing a mask, then there's the whole issue of social interaction and who feels comfortable with what comes into play as well.
Shall I launch
one in?
Shall I launch our second webinar? So that's the webinar poll, sorry.
Yeah, but can I just ask this question as well? Dougie, how can sound operators be protected being out front in the audience when they mix the show? They're the only backstage department that has to cross the boundary between front of house and back of house.
Yeah, again, I would be looking for PPE in people in those circumstances as well, in particular with masks.
Yeah. Okay, so the second poll, this is one that Doug in particular was interested in. This is about travel to work. Would you feel safe travelling to and from your workplace before social distancing restrictions are totally lifted? So that's yes or no. So I'm just about to launch that now. So if we carry on with the questions.
Yeah, one last one for Dougie, then I'll go back to Helen. So Dougie, what are the current recommendations, if you know them, on returning to workplaces when unfurloughed for the odd day? Do risk assessments need to be already in place, or is reducing the number of people in at one time enough?
Risk assessments would need to be in place. If you're opening up, you need to have done your risk assessment in advance.
Okay, thank you. Well, I mean, there are over 40 questions now, so I'm going to look at Okay, can I just answer this question? Freelancers like myself, a prop supervisor who have to go in and out of rehearsal rooms, are really going to struggle with this idea of isolation. Wouldn't an insistence on temperature testing be a better option? And that's certainly the case that employers are looking into, not just what Dougie mentioned about keeping people in isolation in hotels, but they are looking at taking temperatures on a daily basis, investing themselves in this equipment. It will all be quite expensive, and testing, and therefore coming up against the problem of isolating as well. So all of these issues are incredibly complicated and need to be looked into, which is why it pushes back the possibility of live events opening until virus is basically, you know, restrained or contained.
Yeah, I would back that up, Sophie. I mean, there's quite a lot of chat. Some of it came out of yesterday's meeting with theatre managers, as well as the ABTT last week, that social distancing and live events don't really work. And one of the drivers behind that is always economic, because if you can only have a 20% capacity within your auditorium, then there's not really any point in opening up, because you're going to be operating at a loss. So that kind of thing is quite a driver behind it as well. And Naomi as well, you know, with your live events and things like that as well, like rock concerts and bars and, you know, mosh pits and stuff. I mean, social distancing and a mosh pit don't really work together, do they?
Well, I think one of the things for, you know, for people in live events outside of theatres is, well, I mean, even in theatres, I've been having conversations with some employers where, you know, they're really asking the question, is this actually possible? And I think we are going to have to put a lot of pressure on the government, because I don't think that a lot of employers feel that without some kind of assistance, social distancing is going to be a financially viable option for very long. And certainly in like a club night, you know, how are you going to socially distance something like that? It's just, you know, it's either going to be potentially dangerous, or it's not going to be possible. So yeah, there's a lot of things that the government needs to answer to there, I think.
Yeah.
I've got two questions for Helen. Can I butt in, Naomi? Two questions for Helen. Can we get an idea of how many theatres are currently in redundancy consultation, My theatre is in consultation. It feels rather preemptive that this happened prior to the changes in the furlough scheme and is continuing despite these changes.
Okay, right. We've got about 30 theatres that we're currently in redundancy consultations with. Some of those, they're more advanced than others, dependent upon the state of the finances. The reasons why the companies have started to do the consultations, what we call preemptive, is because of the collective consultation provisions that are either at statute or in the local agreements. So, for example, if you work under the UK Theatres Agreement, there is a 60-day minimum consultation period. So quite a few of the theatres that come under that agreement have started that consultation. Statutory consultation requires a minimum of 30 days if you're making between 20 and 99 redundancies. And that again is the reasons why they're starting to do that consultation now, because of when the additional costs are starting to kick in. We have seen a couple of theatres that have either gone into insolvency or liquidation, administration or liquidation. The problem with leaving any redundancy consultation to that point is that once they've gone into administration, although you can continue to access the furlough scheme, assuming that they can still make the contributions going forward, but you can only access that for a very short period of time, and the administrators have to be certain that there will be a buyer. Well, there's not going to really be that many people gagging to buy theatres at the moment, so that's problematic. And the second one is that if it goes into liquidation, which we've already had a couple do, then you are totally reliant upon making the claim through the government scheme, and that is all capped and restricted to the amounts that you get. So I understand why theatres are starting to do the consultations and starting the discussions now for the smaller ones. I think some of the bigger ones, you know, out there, well, you've probably read it. We were in the Guardian and we were in Stage criticising, I'll name them, the National. We said that was preemptive and unnecessary and unnerving. But, you know, I think that's the reality of where we are. So the simple answer is that there are statutory obligations or contractual obligations to consult, and that's the reasons why we're starting to see them coming through now. Can I just answer a question that I've seen? It's cropped up about 5 times in a slightly different formats, but the question is about whether, if the employers cannot afford to make the contributions, is it possible for them to access, for example, the 60% or the 70% and not make any further contributions, and employees accept that? Unfortunately, that is not the position. The contributions are required in order for, well, it's a conditional of being able to access the job retention scheme. So we were hopeful that that would have been an option, but unfortunately in the government advice that came out on Friday, that is not a possibility.
Would you like the result of the last webinar?
Yes, please.
Sorry, I keep on saying webinar and I mean webinar poll. Okay, I'm going to end it now. We've had 91% of people on the call voting. It's kind of even, so I would imagine that this may reflect different modes of transport, but there's 51% have said yes, they would feel safe travelling to and from their workplace before social distancing restrictions are lifted, and 49% have said no. So I'll share those results.
Thank you. There was a question about how soon are we going to issue support for people who are going to, guidelines and help for people who are returning to work, because there was, and I've lost the question now, but there was a box office that's likely to return in June. I would say as soon as possible. We're working on it now, but I don't know if you want to reply, Dougie.
As soon as possible. We're working on it just now. My answer is the same as yours.
But that's good to know, though, that there are moves to return to work in June.
Yeah. What I'm hopeful of is that when this session finishes and I get the opportunity to look through all the questions in detail and stuff, that will help inform us what questions haven't occurred to us as yet, so as we can flesh out, and that will enable us to get the guidelines together quicker rather than quicker. So
thank you. Helen, there's a question. It says, sorry, this may have been answered, but is it possible for employers to place workers on unpaid leave instead of redundancy, so that their continuity of employment extends to when the theatre reopens, and then when the theatre reopens, if it doesn't reopen, are they still entitled to redundancy at the end of it?
Well, that's going to depend on what agreements we reach regarding layoffs and short time working. As all the officials know, because I've told them till I'm bluing in the face, we will not agree to overarching clauses that bind us to the statutory minimum provisions, which are absolutely atrocious. So what we've said is that we will enter into what we call enabling provisions, so that we will discuss company by company, theatre by theatre, the provisions of what short time or layoff working week can be. The only thing we have to be really careful about is that in any agreement, we cannot agree or negotiate away any statutory minimum terms. And so therefore we've got to be very clear about how we put together any of these layoff agreements. The only concern I have with regard to that proposal of doing that, which is stop off for however long it's going to be, is it depends upon the viability of the future of that theatre. So for example, you might have 20 years service, built up that amount of money ready for redundancy, decide not to take your redundancy, you're off for 6 months, and then at the end of the 6 months the theatre's not viable and it goes into liquidation, then you would be stuck with the government caps on the government scheme. So I think we have to think very, very carefully, and it couldn't be a blanket application across the piece. I think people will have to have the choice and the option of what they want to do.
Thank you. Dougie, there's a question, is anything happening to look at health and safety surrounding touring theatre and accommodation stroke digs? Have you heard of, are any employers thinking about this? Any producers?
It came up in the conversation with ABTT last week, but it was just a very initial general question that was asked of the panel. It's on my list of things to look at, because what I've been looking at, in the main, what I've been looking at is static risk assessments for theatres and workplaces. But obviously, when people are moving from one theatre to another, there's a whole other tranche of risks and things need to be looked into as well. So that will be done.
I suspect the answer to this, Doug, is yes. It's the Graham Coyle question. You referenced safe working practice guidance from the London Production Division with ABTT and many other UK and international sets of reopening and production guidance available in the wild. Is there scope for Bectu to help collate and distill guidance for their membership, or are Bectu actively participating in maybe an industry-wide guidance approach, noting that one size won't necessarily fit all?
That's what we're attempting to do, is to do guidance for our members in the first instance. Where that's what we're here for, is to look after our members' interests. But obviously we'll work in conjunction with as many trade associations and employers as necessary. But the priority is to provide guidance for our members.
And that feeds into Catherine's question: how can we feed into the health and safety process and help create risk assessments? Yes, exactly. That's what we're doing. Providing guidance with kind of with blueprints of what risk assessments can look like.
Yes, that's it exactly.
There's a question here for you, Helen. I'm a 0-hour contract technician of 13 years service. Would I qualify for redundancy?
Oh, thank you, Sophie, for giving me that one. Not the easiest of questions to answer, hey? The difficulty we have with 0 hours workers is that the employers construe the contracts in a manner that they try and assert that they're a worker, not an employee. And what we have to do is, on each individual case, we have to go through and we have to try and establish whether the individual has been worked in a manner that has changed the contractual relationship from that of being a worker to that of being an employee. For those who have worked with me in some of my branches know that this is a laborious task, but actually we have been quite successful in some areas in winning that argument. And as I keep saying to employers, just because you've put a label on the tin to say it's something doesn't necessarily mean to say that's what's in the actual tin itself. So if you look at the contract on the face of it, the contract will say you're a worker. And the employer will argue that you're not entitled to anything. What we have to do is pick it apart and see what we can try and do. The problem is that the case law is all over the place on all of this. So, you know, effectively at law, even a day can break continuity of employment, but that's quite a harsh way. We look at the other case laws that is more around actually around university lecturers, where you know you worked in a manner or a custom and practice and you can't substitute, you actually have to give your availability, all of those types of things, and that established that there was actually an employment relationship rather than that of a worker. It's not easy, but we do look at it.
Brilliant, thank you. Here's another tough one, I think, because I'm not sure there's been government guidance on it. If employers bring employees back on a part-time basis and then need to make redundancies, would it be at the part-time salary or the pre-COVID salary?
Right, it depends upon what you would do on the agreement. And so if you remember back to our good old BBC days, how can we forget those? The BBC agreement on redundancy, and I know this because I argued it, which was that it took into consideration all full-time and part-time service throughout the duration, which is actually not what the employment law says. So what the normal employment law says is that your redundancy is usually calculated on your last salary. So if you've gone from full-time to part-time, that disadvantages you. But if you've gone from part-time to full-time, it's obviously of benefit to you. So we would have to look at all of those points when we reach the agreements going forward for any variations. Because
there should be an argument for looking at your real salary, much in the way that holiday pay is based on your real salary and not what you might have been doing during the furlough period. So yes, let's hope that there is that we can argue it's exceptional.
It would have to be. It would require a change in the regulations governing redundancy. But we could always argue an exceptional issue because we're in an exceptional circumstance. I'm just saying we're probably better off doing that through local arrangements and local agreements. Yeah. It's something that we need to look at. The same goes for holiday pay as well.
There's something here about from Joe. I'm currently working full-time. Are companies still allowed to chop and change furlough staff and working staff? when flexible furlough is in place.
Yes.
I thought so, yeah.
Yeah, because Prospect is doing that itself. We're doing it as an employer, or we will be doing it.
Okay, here's one. I'm not sure I quite understand it. If we can't have a guaranteed job at the end of this after being made redundant, would it be possible to ask for everyone to resign so we can have a guaranteed job when they reopen?
Well, I wouldn't advise doing that. So.
No. The point about guaranteeing your job is about maintaining your continuity of employment. So maintaining your contract uninterrupted, which is why we're looking at the, you know, what was raised earlier about unpaid leave, about layoff clauses, some way of not closing the post, not having redundancy, but just maintaining it until reopening, because at the time of reopening, that's when your job reopens as well. And there's a huge advantage for employers to have the team in place, and they can hit the ground running, because there are all sorts of costs in time and money in having to recruit and put people together and train people up and so on. So we're hoping that there is quite a lot of leverage in being able to, for those who want it. I mean, some may want to just take the redundancy money and help them through the next few months on the basis of that money. But for those who would rather choose to stay, then I hope that we have some leverage in saying, look, it's of benefit to the employer as well as the employee to keep the team together. Now, Helen, have you spotted any other questions?
No.
We've got over 60.
I saw a question that Doug might want to answer, but
Yeah.
Whether it's that answerable, I don't know, but this is a question that certainly I've been asked. And so what can I do about a stubborn work colleague who will not go home if he is showing symptoms of COVID-19?
That actually is an issue that's already come up in some of the draft guidance stuff. Is there needs to be a way of reporting breaches to, you know, the risk assessment says this is what you should do and this is what you can't do, and one of those things is you have to follow it, and so there should be a method clearly stated to workers how they report breaches in people not adhering to the risk assessment and the policy. So, I mean, whether it's whistleblowing or a way of doing it anonymously, or, you know, just, you know, if you saw one of your colleagues dipping into the till in the box office, there'd be a way of reporting it to management. So it's a serious offence along those lines for sure.
Also, I've added another poll without telling the other panelists, because I know I've gone rogue. Because I was curious, because something that's come up with live events, a lot of my live events employers, is that they've been saying, we don't think it's financially viable to come back with social distancing. And I just was curious what the people on the call felt about social distancing measures in relation to theatres. So the poll, I'm just going to launch it now. So the poll, the actual question is, do you think it's possible for theatres to open and remain financially viable with social distancing measures in place and no financial support from the government? Because I think the lobbying at the moment is we're really, this is kind of a crunch time for that getting some kind of financial support from government. So I'm just going to launch that now, and I'll leave that up for a few minutes.
Okay, so here's a couple of questions for Helen. I'm hearing a great deal about employed staff and little about freelancers proper. Is Bectu committed to supporting our case for proper extension of the SEISS scheme at the current levels and not diminishing it? Maybe months until I get more work. I mean, the answer is yes, we are campaigning, but there may be detail.
Can I answer? On Friday, the self-employed scheme was also extended for a period of 3 months. That was reduced down to 70%, and that 3-month grant can be claimed in August. So we did campaign for that. So when we were campaigning for the extension of the permanently, or the PAYE people, we were also heavily lobbying for freelance workers. Yes, we saw that extension as well.
There was a question about what percentage are freelance workers of our members.
I can roughly give you that figure because I worked out the other day. It's in theatres. So I'm not bringing in live events here, because if we bring in live events, then it's more heavily towards freelancers. But in theatres, at the moment, we have people who declare themselves as freelancers. Now, taking into account, they could be PAYE, short fixed-term contractors who move around, or genuine Schedule D freelancers. But that grouping is around about 40% of our membership.
Okay, thank you. And just to answer the question that's come in about as freelancers, we have nobody to top up our 70% or our 60% or our 80%. That's true, but also most employers are not topping up the PAYE 80% any longer because they're running out of money. So it's a way of cushioning, and we've argued for the largest possible amount of cushioning, and we're continuing to argue for that for both freelancers and PAYE. There's a question here: what if our employee makes us redundant? Sorry, what if our employer makes us redundant with a view to re-employ us or the next employee with much worse benefits or conditions in a new contract? And Helen might want to answer this because, of course, we are dealing with the overarching SALT and UK theatres on terms and conditions.
If they're members of SALT or UK theatres, then they are obliged to honour the conditions and the agreements, the minimum terms agreements, and I stress that they are minimum terms agreements, of those two agreements with Bectu. I mean, it's quite interesting because we can have a debate about, you know, how do you change your collective arrangements. So it's and then people think that because they've got a contract and they've got contractual terms that the employer can't actually change that. But actually employers can, and there's various ways that they can vary the terms of the contract. What's there to stop them from dismissing? And well, they wouldn't make you redundant and then rehire you if that's what they wanted to do and effectively move away from those collective arrangements. Effectively what they do is probably serve notice and dismiss and reinstate, because that's one way of varying a contract of employment. So you know, I think that would be quite a hostile move on the employer's part, and I think it would be quite unusual to see. But I, as I say, what I said earlier, I think theatres will be coming to us looking for changes and variations, albeit we will argue temporary variations to some of the collective arrangements that we've got.
Thank you.
Sophie,
I think we've got about 15 minutes left, haven't we?
I just ram in with a question that I just thought might be worth flagging up to Helen. Freelancers, casuals are largely not covered by this discussion. There is a lot of chat regarding having a touring freelancers rep. Can this happen?
Yes, we've got a new UK theatres touring branch that has been launched. There's I think there's about 8 reps now that have come forward. They keep coming into my inbox saying I'd like to be a rep, and we're trying to sort out the training for those so that we can try and train them all together because they've been in a particular area. We're in the process of trying to identify any members who we're giving them the option to move into that branch and transfer into it, so that we can start looking at establishing norms and looking at rates, because there is a big problem with rates around touring, because they're actually little to no minimum rates that we can actually rely upon there. So yeah, when you talk about casuals, I probably talk about employees and workers, in that I include casuals. So I don't differentiate. So casuals, my premise and my starting block is always that they're covered by, if they're PAYE casuals, then they should be covered by our agreements anyway. and that's what we always argue. So apologies if it's my terminology, but when I talk about workers and employees, I include casuals on that.
Yes, and thank you very much to all the members and reps who started the touring group. That's certainly growing and worth joining. A question for Dougie: if when we return we find out we've been in contact with someone with symptoms and we have to isolate, will we get sick pay to do this because we've been in contact with someone with symptoms?
Yeah, as I understand it, if you have to self-isolate, then you get sick pay. Helen, am I right in that?
I believe that is the case, yes.
Yeah. So yes. Sophie's frozen again.
Oh, well.
No, that's just me. It's just my phone.
Oh. Do you want me to get the result of the webinar poll? So
yes, please.
Go on, go for it. I'm trying to find the next question.
Okay, you find the next question. Okay, right. So the question was, do you think it's possible for theatres to open and remain financially viable with social distancing measures in place and no financial support from the government? And I think this is sort of reflecting what I expected. 94% have said no, and 6% have said yes. I mean, that was about 95% of the call answered. There was some chat about it depends on the size of the venue and things like that. But I mean, I have been having conversations with some really big institutions, and they've been saying pretty much the same thing, because I would have thought that the bigger institutions would be able to would be in the best place to be able to cope with that. So I think this really does reflect how important it is for us to like really push hard on the government. They need to step up. So I share those results.
Thank you. Dougie, two for you. Oops. Two for you. Are any industry workers involved in the health and safety guidelines, the ones we're putting together, I assume? As has been said, all departments have different concerns and one size does not fit all. I think, Dougie, you are, aren't you?
Well, yes. I mean, the ABTT, that is people who are actually professionals in the technical side of things. So yes.
But in the ones that you're putting together for theatre?
Yeah, well, it's going to go out as a sort of consultation exercise as well. So yes, we will be looking for feedback and we will be involving people with it for sure.
And do employers or should employers have to consult with employees over new COVID risk assessments? Should these risk assessments be made available to employees in advance of returning back to work?
Yes, and also the guidance from health and safety executive is that they should be published on the employer's website.
Right. Okay, Helen, I'm not sure if you've already talked about this when you were talking about variations of contract, but it says, I've heard that theatres will go back to encouraging up to 9 or even 10 shows a week to make up for the loss of ticket sales. What could be done to stop working over 48 hours?
I think that's, again, something that we are going to have to look at in collective consultation and negotiation. We all know that opting out of the working time regulation should be voluntary. We also know that it appears probably 99.9% of the time in theatres to be obligatory in the actual contracts. I think this is something that is of concern to myself and definitely the reps that I've spoken to around health and safety. So it's the second part of health and safety, in my view, not just about the problems with the impact of COVID and the safety in the actual workplace, but actually the working practices when we go forward with long hours. We already know the industry's plagued with low pay, long hours. So it's on my radar that I think we have to address and deal with the employers.
Thank you. Quick answer to Ashley. If an employer decides to top up wages to 100% from the beginning of furlough, but are now saying they don't have any money and can't pay the obligatory contribution required by government, could they be liable to legal action if mass redundancies follow? No. The whole thing about the furlough scheme, I'm afraid, was that it is voluntary. So it was brought in to help employers hang on to workers for as long as possible and to help the government avoid very long queues for universal credit. But it was completely voluntary. The top-up was completely voluntary. So employers chose whether to use the furlough scheme or not. And as Helen said, the theatre industry has been really quite remarkable. We've had a lot of discussions with many, many different employers, but it's quite remarkable in the end how many of them did want to look after their staff and furlough them. They can at any point stop topping up, and as the money is running out, they have stopped topping up. And in the end, mass redundancies may follow, because the argument is that there is a cessation or reduction of work. I mean, in this case, complete cessation, probably for 6 months. And that answers the question also about someone saying, I'm concerned about being made redundant. I'm the technical manager, a small receiving theatre. My only technician is furloughed. If the theatre is still in business, can they make me redundant? Obviously, we have very small income, well, no income, but this will change. In your case, yes, you could be made redundant. They could just hold on to one key person. They could just hold on to this, maybe the CEO or maybe the director of finance, and everybody else has to be made redundant because they just haven't got the money to continue. So they're mothballing the theatre essentially. The truth is, though, that we, Bectu, come in and negotiate with your theatre and on your behalf, and we argue the pros and cons and say, does it make sense? If you don't want to be made redundant, does it make sense to do this now? Wouldn't you want to keep a small team that you're going to rely on when you reopen together? So I hope that answers it. Yes, there can be mass redundancies, but at the same time, it's our task with you and with the strength of your feeling and the membership to explain why there may be ways of saving jobs and keeping everybody together for as long as possible.
Sophie, we're getting quite a lot of questions about the same thing and in the chat.
Oh, well done. What is it?
Basically, that people would like to know how can members move into the touring branch? How do they identify themselves and get into that if they want to?
If they email me direct, then I can redirect them to the necessary people to be able to transfer them. So I think you've all got my email address. If not, I'm on the website. If not, it's hryan@bectu.org.uk. I'll put it into and I'll also put in Harge's. So if you email me and Harge, we'll sort the transfer out. I'll put it into the chat now so that everybody's got it. Okay, you just have to tell us that you need to move into the UK touring branch. All right.
This has cropped up a few times. If someone decided to take unpaid leave for an agreed period, presumably that would bar them from claiming any benefits during that time. I would say yes. I don't know enough about unemployment benefits and the schemes at the moment, but if you're still on contract, you're on contract. But the way that you can negotiate the unpaid leave is that during that time, you're allowed to seek work elsewhere. I don't know if anyone, Helen or anyone, wants to add to that.
I was typing the addresses. What was the question?
Oh, sorry. It was about if you agree to go on unpaid leave for several months, presumably that excludes you from claiming benefits from government like universal credit and so on, which I would assume it does. But you can make you know, and this is all about negotiation. You could reach an agreement that you could seek work elsewhere. If there is any work elsewhere, because there is, you know, a job market with no jobs in it at the moment.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on universal credit or the benefit system, so I think that's one thing we need to look at and look into before you actually start going down and reaching those type of agreements, so that when members make a decision as to what they want to do, they have the full information at their fingertips. And we do have contacts in the job centres and things that we can ask them for professional advice on what it would mean and the impacts on benefits.
Okay,
Just to say, I put that in the chat, Helen. So just concentrate on the webinar. It's fine. Your email's in there.
Do you have any thoughts on when it will be that theatres are able to reopen safely? No, it all depends. You know, for all we know, there may be a second spike thanks to idiots like Cummings, or it's all about moving very carefully and seeing how safe it is to remove social distancing. So when can theatres open safely? When the requirements for social distancing are lifted, because then it will be safe to sit in an auditorium, even if you still take all the precautions of wearing masks and all the rest of it. And at the moment, the rumour is originally they were hoping that they could open in September. That has moved to December, and now some people are saying we really won't open until April next year. So it's anyone's guess, because we just don't know what the virus is going to do next. Everyone talks about long tails and second spikes and all that. So we have to globally, really, this is an issue globally, we have to look at look and learn from the experience of our country and different countries. There's a question from Joshua. Helen, I don't know if you can see it. My theatre group are currently waiting for dates from a theatre to postpone our show. We only have up until June 21 to perform the show, otherwise we will lose the rights to perform. We've discussed cancelling, but the theatre we've meant to perform in have told us if we cancel, then we will have to refund all the customers, which may mean losing hundreds of pounds and possibly closure. Are they allowed to do this? By they, I assume you mean the theatre that's hosting you. It all depends. I'm sorry, we'll have to look at this question more closely, because it all depends on the contract that your company has with the receiving house. But yes, in theory, the receiving house could insist on them honouring the contract in full, which will bankrupt them.
Oops.
Okay, so I'm just giving you a 1 minute warning, because we're supposed to be off the system in, well, we can maybe run over by a minute, but maybe just pick the last question to answer.
Okay, good point. Thank you so much, though, because this has been a very varied session. It's difficult to keep a grip on all the different subjects, or just all the different questions popping up. So I think it's really important that we write a report back and we answer as many as we possibly can. And I'm having a look. Dougie, you choose one from health and safety. I'll try this one. Helen, if your contract of employment has been changed temporarily as you are working part-time and this is being extended, does that mean it is now a permanent variation of contract?
You would need to look at how the contract got varied in the first instance, and that it was clearly a temporary variation, and that any extension would also be a temporary extension. So as with all contract queries, the devil is in the detail. So I would strongly advise any letters of extension or anything to do with that, please pass on to your official, and we will actually go through it and look and advise accordingly.
Yes, I think that's the big takeaway, is that it's an absolute no-brainer to be part of a union now. Please tell all your friends who have been consistently resistant to this, that whatever crops up, we're the ones who have the parliamentary lobbyists, who have the free legal advice, and that are here to unpick all these complicated issues, as well as Helen said, negotiate employer by employer and with the big employer groups such as SALT and UK theatres. And we're trying to find the simplest, the easiest ways to help everybody who's working in theatre. And that's why we need to hear from all of you and represent all of you. Any last thoughts, Helen and Doug?
There's been a couple of people saying they want to get a summary of questions and answers and things as well. So once we got offline, Naomi and I can talk about how we're actually going to do that, and I'll pick that one up and do it as quickly as possible.
The only thing I would like to say is I'm so pleased that so many of you participated and have actually been very vocal with all your questions and comments. So I think that's been really quite good. Like us to probably look at doing another one in a couple of weeks' time, just so that we can actually keep in touch with everyone and we can give you all updates on what's going on. Unfortunately for the officials, ever since that fateful day, I think we have lived a life of turmoil like everybody else, with things constantly changing almost on a daily basis. As we keep arguing and fighting for the schemes to be pushed to their max and get as much help to people as we can. So I'd just like to say thank you.
Thank you very much. Keep safe. Talk soon. Bye.
Bye.
Everyone.